can we point to one specific general phenomenon in the body that underlies aging?
Unfortunately, in the 2000s, we rallied around this new map of aging with these causes or hallmarks. But I think that there's one slice of the pizza that is way larger than the others. And we can get to that, but that's the information in the cell that we call the epigenome.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the epigenome. Frame it for us, if you will, and then we'll get into ways that one can adjust the epigenome in positive ways.
Yeah, so in science, what I like to do, I'm a reductionist, is to boil it down. And I actually ended up boiling aging down to an equation, which is the loss of information due to entropy. It's a hard thing to overcome the second law of thermodynamics, that's fair. But this equation really represents the fact that I think aging is a loss of information in the same way that when you Xerox something 1,000 times, you'll lose that information, or you try to copy a cassette tape, or even if you send information across the internet, some of it will get lost. That's what I think is aging. And there are two types of information in the body. There is the genetic information, which is digital, A, T, C, G, the chemical letters of DNA. But there's this other part of the information in the body that's just as important. It's essential, in fact, and that's the systems that control which genes are switched on and off, in what cell, at what time, in response to what we eat, etc. And it turns out that 80% of our future longevity and health is controlled by this second part, the epigenetic information, the control systems. I liken the DNA to the music that's on a DVD or a compact disc. For the younger people, we used to use these things.
I recall.
Yeah. And then the epigenome is the reader that says, okay, in this cell, we need to play that set of songs. And in this other cell, we have to play a different set of songs. But over time, aging is the equivalent of scratching the CD and the DVD so that you're not playing the right songs. And cells, when they don't hear the right songs, they get messed up and they don't function well. And that is what I'm saying is the main driver of aging. And these other hallmarks are largely manifestations of that process. There are studies that show that the slower you take to develop, it also is predictive of having a longer, healthier life. And it may have something to do with growth hormone. We know that growth hormone is pro-aging. Anyone who's taking growth hormone, pay attention. We know
Just look at someone who's taking growth hormone.
Yeah.
They often will acquire these characteristics of vitality, like improved smoothness of skin, but their whole body shape changes.
Yeah, I mean, you'll feel better for a short amount of time. You'll build up muscle, you feel great, but it's like burning your candle at both ends. Ultimately, if you want to live longer, you want less of that. And the animals that have been generated and mutants that have low growth hormone, sometimes these are dwarfs, they live the longest by far. A guy in my lab, Michael Bonkowski, he had the longest lived mouse. A mouse typically lives about 2 and a bit years. He had a mouse that lived 5 years, and he gave it caloric restrictions, so fasting, combined with one of these dwarf mutations, low growth hormone. I think he called it Yoda. But this is, you look at who lives the longest, it's the really small people. The good news is that the epigenome can change. Those loops and structures can be modified by how you live your life. And so if you're born tall, and I wasn't, and I wished at the time I did grow, but no matter what size you are, you can have a bigger impact on your life than anything your genes give you. 80% is epigenetic, not genetic.
So let's talk about some of the things that people can do. And I've kind of batched these into categories rather than just diving right into actionable protocols. So the first one relates to food, blood sugar, insulin. This is something I hear a lot about, that fasting is good for us, but rarely do I hear why it's good for us. One of the reasons I'm excited to talk to you today is because I want to drill into the details of this, because I think understanding the mechanism will allow people to make better choices and not simply to just decide whether or not they're going to fast or not fast or how long they're going to fast. I think should be dictated by some understanding of the mechanism. So why is it that having elevated blood sugar, glucose, and insulin ages us more quickly? And or why is it that having periods of time each day, or perhaps longer, can extend our lifespan?
Well, let's start with what I think was a big mistake, was the idea that people should never be hungry. We live in a world now where there's at least 3 meals a day, And then we've got companies selling bars and snacks in between. So the feeling of hunger, some people never experience hunger in their whole lives. It's really, really bad for them. It was based, I believe, on the 20th century view that you don't want to stress out the pancreas, and you try to keep insulin levels pretty steady, and not have this fluctuation. What we actually found, my colleagues and I, across this field of longevity, is that when you look at, first of all, animals, whether it's a dog or a mouse or a monkey, the ones that live the longest, by far, 30% longer, and stay healthy, are the ones that don't eat all the time. It actually was first discovered back in the early 20th century, but people ignored it. And then it was rediscovered in the 1930s. Clive McKay did caloric restriction. He put cellulose in the food of rats so they couldn't get as many calories even though they ate. And those rats lived 30% longer. But then it went away, and then it came back in the 2000s in a big way when a couple of things happened. One is that my lab and others showed that there are longevity genes in the body that come on and protect us from aging and disease. The group of genes that I work on are called sirtuins. There's 7 of them. And we showed in 2005 in a science paper that if you have low levels of insulin and another molecule called insulin-like growth factor, those low levels turn on the longevity genes. One of them that's really important is called SIRT1. But by having high levels of insulin all day, being fed means your longevity genes are not switched on. So you're falling apart. Your epigenome, your information that keeps your cells functioning over time just degrades quicker. Your clock is ticking faster by always being fed. Okay. The other thing that I think might be happening by always having food around is that it's not allowing the cell to have periods of rest and reestablish the epigenome. And so it also is accelerating in that direction. There's plenty of other reasons as well that are not as profound, such as having low levels of glucose in your body will trigger your major muscles and your brain to become more sensitive to insulin and suck the glucose out of your bloodstream, which is very good. You don't want to have glucose flowing around too much. And that will ward off type 2 diabetes.
So hunger, of course, is associated with low blood glucose and low insulin. Do you think there's anything about the subjective experience of hunger itself that could be beneficial for longevity?
Yeah, I do. Though you get used to the feeling of not eating. So I'm kind of screwed that way.
It's like cold water. You eventually adapt.
You get used to it, unfortunately. But there are some studies that are being done at the National Institutes of Health that are able to simulate the effect of hunger, but still provide the calories. And it's looking like there's a small component that's due to hunger. But most of it actually is because you've got these periods of not being fed, and then the body turns on these defensive genes. There's a really interesting experiment that was published maybe a couple of years ago by Rafael De Cabo down at the NIH. What he did was he took over 10,000 mice and gave them different combinations of fat, carbohydrate, protein, and he was trying to figure out what was the best combination. And then he also cleverly had two groups, one that was fed all the time or ate as much as they wanted, and the other group was only given food for an hour a day. And it turns out they ate roughly the same amount of calories because, of course, in an hour, they're stuffing their faces. It turns out it didn't matter what diet he gave them. It was only the group that ate within that window that lived longer and dramatically longer. So my conclusion is, and mice are very similar to us metabolically, I think that tells us that it's not as important what you eat, it's when you eat during the day. I would say definitely try to skip a meal a day. That's the best thing.
Does it matter which meal, or are they essentially equivalent?
Well, as long as it's at the end or the beginning of the day, because then you add that to the sleep period where you're hopefully not eating.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what I do. I skip breakfast. I have a tiny bit of yogurt or olive oil because the supplements I have need to be dissolved in it. And then I go throughout the whole day, as I'm doing right now here with this glass of water here. I'm just keeping myself filled with liquids, and so I don't feel hungry. Beware that the first 2 to 3 weeks when you try that, you will feel hungry, and you also have a habit of wanting to chew on something. There's a lot of physical parts to it. But try to make it through the first 3 weeks and do without breakfast or do without dinner, and you'll get through it. And I did that for most of my life, actually. mainly because I wasn't hungry in the morning. Some people are very hungry in the morning, and they may want to consider skipping dinner instead. But I will go throughout the whole day. I don't get the crashes of the high glucose and the low glucose. That anyone who goes, oh man, it's 3 o'clock, I'm going to need to sleep. If you do what I do, you will not experience that anymore. Because what my body does is it regulates blood sugar levels naturally. My liver is putting out glucose when it needs to, and it's very steady and gives me pure focus throughout the day. And I don't even have to think about lunch. I'm just powering through. At dinner, I love food as much as anybody. So I will eat a regular, pretty healthy meal. I'll try to eat mostly vegetables. I can eat some fish, some shrimp. I rarely will eat a steak. In fact, my microbiome is so adapted to my diet. Now, if I eat a steak, it will not get digested very well. I'll feel terrible. So there's a system called the autophagy system, which digests old and misfolded proteins in the body. And there's a natural cleansing that happens when you're hungry. Macroautophagy, its name is. But a good friend of mine, Anna Maria Cuervo at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, discovered a deep cleanse called the chaperone-mediated autophagy, which kicks in day 2, day 3, which really gets rid of the deep proteins. And what excites me is she just put out a big paper that said, if you trigger this process in an old mouse, it lives 35% longer. Should you supplement with growth hormone or testosterone? All of these activities will give you immediate benefits. You'll bulk up more, you'll feel better immediately. But based on the research, it's at the expense of long-term health. So my view of longevity, the way I treat my body is, I don't burn both candles. I have one end of the candle lit. I'm very careful, I don't blow on it. But I also do enough exercise that I'm building up my muscle, but I'm not huge. Anyone who's seen me, knows that I'm not a professional bodybuilder. But I tried to actually, here's the key, and I haven't said this publicly that I can remember, I pulse things so that I get periods of fasting, and then I eat, then I take a supplement, then I fast, then I exercise, and I'm taking the supplements and eating in the right timing to allow me to build up muscle sometimes. Because you can't just expect to take something constantly and do something constantly for it to work. And that's why it's taken me about 15 years to develop my protocol. And there's a lot of subtlety to it.
So at a cellular level, like we kind of go back to mTOR and the sirtuins, how do you think that the cells might be reacting to this kind of lowercase feast and uppercase famine type protocol?
Right. Well, the pulsing, I think, is what you want to do is to get the cells to be perceiving adversity. Okay? Because our modern life, we're sitting around, we're eating too much, we're not exercising. Our cells respond. They go, hey, everything's cool, no problem. And they become relaxed and they don't turn on their defenses, and we age rapidly. We can see it in the clock. People who exercise and eat less have a slower ticking clock. It's a fact. But my protocol is different than most people's because I am pulsing it. Now, first of all, let's get to why did I even think that might be possible? Because I didn't read the Warrior Diet. What I found in my research was that if we gave resveratrol, this red wine molecule that became well known in the 2000s, if we gave it to mice their whole lifespan, they were protected against a high-fat diet, which we call the Western diet. They had lean organs. They lived slightly longer, but not a lot. And if we gave them a high-fat diet without resveratrol, they actually lived a lot shorter. So resveratrol protected them against the high-fat diet. We gave it to them on a normal diet. They just ate it when they wanted, and there wasn't much effect. This is what's not known, though it's in the supplemental data of the paper that nobody ever reads. The mice that were given resveratrol every second day on a normal diet lived dramatically longer than any other group. So people out there, my critics say, oh, resveratrol didn't extend the lifespan of mice on a normal diet, therefore it's not aging, it's just protecting against a high-fat diet. Well, look at the supplemental data, please. If you give it to the mice every other day, we had mice living over 3 years. I always take metformin in the morning, along with the resveratrol, because for a number of reasons, but mainly because my body responds better. And I've been measuring my body for 12, 13 years. But here's the thing. If I'm going to exercise that day, I will skip the metformin. And a lot of people who do pay attention to this kind of thing think that they should stop taking metformin because they're never going to get muscle, or it's going to affect their ability to build up muscle. But that's not true. What metformin does to you, it actually just reduces your ability to have stamina because it's inhibiting your body's ability to make energy. And so what happens is when you're on metformin, you do fewer reps. But guess what? Those muscles that you do build up on metformin have the same strength and have much lower inflammation and other markers of aging. You just won't have that extra 5% size of muscles. So if you want large muscles, don't take metformin and you'll be fine during your exercise. But for me, I'm not trying to get giant. I want strong muscles and I want to live longer and healthier. So I just try to time it so that I get the most reps out of my exercise regime. But sometimes in scientific literature, it's worth bringing this up. If there's a 5% difference in a graph, then either the press release or some reporter will say, oh my goodness, big difference, 5%, can't take metformin during exercise. That's the headline. And then you go in and it's barely significant and the graph is distorted because they've changed the axes to make it look bigger. And now it's become a myth that metformin greatly inhibits your ability to exercise, which is not true. But in an abundance of caution, I skip my metformin on days I'm going to exercise. And not only that, I'm one of the 20% of people that has a stomach sensitivity to it. So if I'm not feeling great that day, I don't take it either.
What are your thoughts on berberine as an alternative to metformin? And are there any cautionary notes? I mean, obviously people should talk to their doctor before adding or subtracting anything from their life, including breath work or anything that comes up. But with all that set aside, what are your thoughts about berberine and timing of low blood sugar and these sorts of things?
Right. Well, before I had access to metformin, I was taking berberine. It's often known as the poor man's metformin, though that
he just called me poor.
Women can take it too. So the thing with berberine, and we've studied it in my lab, it is effective at boosting energetics in the body, just like AMPK and metformin does. And we've actually given it to rats and mice and seen that they are very healthy, especially on a high-fat diet. So I think it's likely to be good. There are some human studies that exist, clinical trials showing that it increases insulin sensitivity. You have to take high doses.
Which is a good thing, right?
Yeah.
I think when people hear insulin sensitivity, sometimes people think, oh, well, that's bad, right? No, but you want your cells to be insulin sensitive. You don't want a lot of blood sugar floating around that can't be sequestered into cells.
Exactly. So this is anti-type 2 diabetes. And so this berberine does have wonderful effects on the metabolism of animals, and in some clinical trials on dozens of people it's been tested. Now there's one cautionary tale which just came up. Matt Kaberlein's lab published that berberine reduced the lifespan of worms. But I'm not sure worms trump human clinical trials at this point. So I would say...
Not in my opinion.
I wouldn't
but no disrespect to my C. elegans colleagues, or rather my colleagues that work on C. elegans.
Yeah. Well, what I like to do is to give all the information. People can decide what they want. But I would say, if based on the worm data, I wouldn't panic just yet. I think berberine has been shown to be really safe in humans.
You mentioned resveratrol. I think now would be a great time to talk a little bit about protocols for resveratrol, grapeseed extract, et cetera. Let's start with the obvious one that I know you get a lot, but for the record, can't I just drink red wine and get enough resveratrol, David?
You can try. You need to drink about 200 glasses a day. So
I'm sure it's been tried.
There are some. And I drink a glass of red wine a day if I get the chance. But any more than that, it's a lot of calories and your liver will get fatty and it's all bad. So, I mean, realistically, you can only get the 1,000 milligrams that I take a day from a supplement that's pure. Now, there are a lot of people selling resveratrol. If it's not light gray or white in color, throw it away. The brown stuff has gone bad or is contaminated. And the contaminated stuff, beware, it'll cause diarrhea. But regular resveratrol should not do that.
So 1,000 milligrams per day is what you do?
Yeah, and I have for about 15 years now.
And you ingest that with some fatty substance like olive oil or yogurt. Is that right?
Yeah, you have to. And other supplements, quercetin, curcumin, these are crunchy things. They're not going to get through your gut. And I'm not just making this up. I always base my statements on human studies. So we've done a lot of studies on resveratrol, as have others since. And we know that we found out early, I was one of the first people to take a high dose resveratrol. And when we included it with food, the levels in my blood went up 5-fold. We realized that olive oil, and particularly oleic acid, one of the monounsaturated fatty acids, is also an activator of the sirtuin defenses. So I'm trying to ingest more of oleic acid.
Along the lines of supplementation, what about NMN, NR, and B3 niacin? I want to know what you do. I also want to know what I should do. And I think most people want to know what they should do. I mean, these are molecules that impact the sirtuin pathway, impact the pathways that control aging or rates of aging in the epigenome. How do they do that? And how does one incorporate that into a supplementation protocol, should they choose to do that?
All right. Well, disclaimer is that I don't recommend anything, but I talk about what I do. So a bit of scientific background, these sirtuin genes that we discovered first in yeast cells when I was at MIT, and then in animals as I moved to Harvard in the 2000s. And one of my first postdocs, actually literally my first postdoc, Chaim Cohen, published a great paper just a couple of months ago and found that turning on the sirtuin 6 gene, remember the 7, number 6 gene is very potent. It extended the lifespan dramatically of mice that he engineered, both males and females, which is great. So what you want to do is naturally boost the activity of these sirtuins. They are genes, but they also make proteins. That's what genes typically make or encode. And then those proteins take care of the body in many different ways, as we've discussed. So how do you turn on these genes and make the proteins they make even more active? You want to rev up that system. So exercise will do it. Fasting will do it. What about supplementation? Well, the first activator of the sirtuins that we discovered that acts on the enzyme to make it do a better job of cleaning up the body and protecting was resveratrol. We looked at thousands of different molecules, eventually tens of thousands. And the one that was the best was resveratrol in the dish. And then we gave it to little organisms, worms, and then flies and mice, eventually humans. And we saw that it activated that enzyme. So resveratrol is one way to activate it. You can think of it as the accelerator pedal on a car. It revs it up. But there's something else that the sirtuins need to work, and that's NAD. NAD is a really small molecule, little chemical in the body that we need for life. It's used by the body for chemical reactions, 400 different reactions in the body, and without it, you're dead within seconds. You need NAD. The problem that we've seen is that NAD levels decline as you become obese, as you get older, if you don't ever get hungry. And the body not only doesn't make enough of it, it's chewing it up as well. There's an enzyme called CD38 that Eric Verdin over at UCSF showed chews up, he's now at the Buck Institute in California, chews up NAD as you get older. So it's a double whammy. You don't make as much, you chew it up, which is really bad because what we've shown in my lab, and so have others, is that NAD levels are really important for keeping those sirtuin defenses at a youthful level. And you can give a lot of resveratrol, but if you don't have the fuel, you're basically accelerating a car that doesn't have enough gas. So you want to do both, and that's what I do. I take a precursor to NAD called NMN, and the body uses that to make the NAD molecule in one step. And so I know from measuring dozens of human beings that if you take NMN for the time period that I do, I've been taking it for years, but if you take it for about 2 weeks, you'll on average, double your NAD levels in the blood. Okay, that's not public information. That's from clinical trials that are not yet published over the last 2 years. There are other ways to increase NAD levels in someone like me who's getting older, I'm 52 now. You can take NR, which is used to make NMN, which is used to make NAD. And both NMN and NR are sold by companies in the US. NR lacks the phosphate. Phosphate's a small chemical that the body needs. You've probably heard of the atom phosphorus. Let's go back one step. How do you make NR? NR gets made from vitamin B3 often, You can also find it in milk and other foods. But sometimes people ask me, why don't you just take vitamin B3 and won't that just force the body to make NAD? And the answer is no, it doesn't work very well. We know this just by doing the experiment. But the reason I think is that NAD is a, I said it's a small molecule, but relative to vitamin B3, it's big. It's got those phosphates on there. It's got a sugar. It's got the vitamin B attached. So you've got all these components that come together to make this very complicated little molecule called NAD. And when you give NMN, it contains all three components that the body needs to make NAD. If you give NR or just vitamin B3, which is an even smaller molecule, the body has to find these other components from somewhere else. So where do you get phosphate? Well, body needs it for DNA, needs it for bones. So high doses of something that requires additional phosphate makes me a little concerned. And we have compared NMN and NR head-to-head in mouse studies. For instance, NMN, we've shown in a Cell paper a few years ago, makes mice run further. Old mice can run 50% further because they have better blood flow, better energy. NR at the same dose did not do that. In fact, it had no effect.
I see. Dosage-wise, if I were elect to take NMN in supplement form to increase my NAD levels and presumably slow my aging, how much NMN should I take? What's the protocol that you do? And are the various forms that are out there, are some better or some worse?
Well, I'm always happy to tell you what I do and what my father does, my 82-year-old father. We take a gram of NMN every day.
So it's a gram of resveratrol and a gram of NMN.
Right.
Okay, 1,000 milligrams.
Now, another important point, which is I'm not the same as everybody else. I have a different microbiome, age, sex, right? And so I've been measuring myself. And so I know if something's, or I think I know if something's making me better or worse based on measuring 45 different things. So I just want people to be aware that what I do may not perfectly work at all for others. But I have studied, as I said, dozens of people who take NMN at a gram, sometimes 2 grams. And I know by looking at all those people that without any exceptions, that if you do what I do, your NAD levels go up by about 2-fold or more.
I want to talk about iron and iron load. We were talking earlier about ferritin. And of course, women menstruate. And so their iron needs are greater than men that don't menstruate, or women that don't menstruate. I don't think we can get right down into how much iron somebody needs because it'll vary person to person. But I was surprised to learn that iron is actually going to accelerate the aging process in various contexts.
Well, this is a new finding out of Spain. Manuel Serrano's lab has found that excess iron will increase the number of senescent cells in the body. And senescent cells are these zombie cells that accumulate as you get older, and they sit there and they cause inflammation mainly, and also can cause cancer. And it's found that if you get rid of these cells or never accumulate them, you stay younger. In animals, and there's some really interesting studies out of Mayo Clinic in humans as well. So iron is a pro-senescent metal. And so what I think is that if you're taking excess iron as a supplement, you're probably accelerating your aging process. The other thing that I found really interesting is I've looked at hundreds of thousands of people's metabolism and their blood biomarkers. I was one of the first people in Inside Tracker as a board member, and I'm still their scientific lead guy. So I can look anonymously at hundreds of thousands of people's blood work. And we also know how fit they are, how old they are. Some of them are marathon runners, some of them are CrossFit. And there's a signature of health that actually is different than your average person. Now, I'm not going to say bad things about MDs because a lot of my best friends are MDs and I work with them at Harvard Medical School. The issue though is that with MD training, there's a scale of what's normal. And if you're out of that normal range, something must be wrong. That's the paradigm that they work under. But first of all, everybody's different. And you want to know their baseline and track people over years to know what's normal for them. And what I find, for for example, is people who are really healthy and live the way I do and have a diet that's fairly vegetarian but not strict, still have slightly low hemoglobin levels, slightly low iron, slightly low ferritin, but we have super amounts of energy. We're not anemic, and we're getting along with great in life. But a doctor who just looks at that might say, oh, we need to give you more iron. Right? So what I'm getting at is an example of we need to personalize medicine and look at people over the long run to know what works for them and what's healthy for them. And not just work towards the average human, but work towards what's optimal for humans.
But what do you think is the relationship between dietary cholesterol and serum cholesterol? And what's going on with the liver? Why are anorexics?
Yeah.
Why is their serum cholesterol so high when they're eating nothing?
Yeah. Well, there have been a number of papers over the years that have been ignored. And our friend Peter Attia brought to my attention recently a new study that I think definitively said that dietary cholesterol has almost zero impact on blood cholesterol levels.
Good. In particular, the amino acids that come from animal products, right, seem to have some pro-aging effect on them, right? At least the way that I've heard you describe your diet. Now, I'm somebody who enjoys meat. I like it. But so I'm by no means a vegan at all. But I've heard you say you eat mostly plants, but a little bit of fish or chicken or something of that sort, or eggs, or but is that specifically to avoid excessive amino acid intake, or is it something specific about plants that excites you with respect to? I mean, vegetables are delicious too, but what is it? Is it something great about plants, or is it something bad about? When I think of meat, I guess the biologist in me thinks amino acids, right? I don't think top sirloin, I think amino acid. No, I think top sirloin as I'm eating it, but really what they are amino acids, including leucine.
Yeah. Well, there are two good things about plants, and neither of them is taste for me. I would eat steak all the time if I could. I did when I was a kid. I'm Australian. But plants have two benefits. One is that they're highly nutritious, and they'll give you a lot of the vitamins and nutrients that I need. I don't take a multivitamin. I don't want to have the excess iron in my body. So there's that high density nutrition. So those dark leaves, if it's a spinach salad, great. The second is that there is what's called Xenohermetic molecules in plants. That term, xenohermesis, is a term that I came up with my friend Conrad Howitz, which means stressed plants make molecules that benefit your health. I'll break it down. Xeno means between species, and hormesis is the term whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger and live longer. And the idea is that when plants are stressed out, think of a grapevine that's dried out and they're starting to harvest the grapes, which is typically how it's done. They are full with resveratrol because resveratrol is a plant defense molecule that I think is made to activate those sirtuin genes in a plant. So plants have sirtuins just like we do. But by purifying or at least concentrating in a light-proof bottle and keeping it out of the air, we stabilize this xenohermetic molecule, or it's a cocktail, not just one. There's others in wine. We then ingest those and get the benefits of activating our own defenses because our food was getting stressed out. And by stressed, I don't mean psychologically stressed, I mean biologically stressed. And so I try to eat plants that have gone through a bit of stress. They might be brightly colored, they've had too much sun or got nibbled on by a caterpillar. So you go to places where it's organic or it's fresh, local, and those are the plants that aren't perfect and they probably have high concentrations of these molecules. And in addition, I also buy the supplements to make sure I'm getting enough of those as well.
Which supplements mimic that?
Well, so resveratrol there's another one called quercetin, or quercetin, some people call it, which you find in trace amounts in apples and onions. And we also showed back in 2003 that it activates sirtuins as well. But others have, 20 years later, found that it kills senescent cells or helps kill senescent cells. So it's a double whammy with that molecule.